Hi, and welcome back to our change series with David and Anku from HouseSpace. We've been talking about change in multiple perspectives, and this time we are going to actually put ourselves in the role of those frontline workers, those people who in organizational changes are actually going to change the most. They will need to change how they do their work if they do it very differently from some previous ways. And usually the leaders have some kind of a vision about the change, but it might take quite a lot to actually transfer it to the people who will change their ways of working. And we actually say that transferring change doesn't work. What do you think about that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. And just for a little bit of context, we've been talking about the multiple levels of the organization. We talked about senior management, we talked about middle, and now this focus is around the frontline staff. We are not in any way espousing that this is how you should be setting up your organizations. In fact, we really believe that having a flatter organization is better. But the reality is, as we get into larger organizations, there does need to be someone steering the ship. There does need to be someone or a group of people setting that direction. And this is what tends to happen. So how do we navigate within that environment? And especially, how do we navigate when we are the frontline staff, when we are the people who are being handed down these edicts and are expected to live them? And again, we go back to leadership. This is where we need a bit of brave leadership to raise our voice up. And I say raise our voice up because typically in these organizations, the leader has a disproportionate voice. Their voice is heard much more above other folks. And this is something that if we're going to be truly effective in leading change, we need to change some of those paradigms. We need to really make that shift so that we're actually hearing more all voices and co-creating and sort of leveling that playing field a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And this is why we love HouseSpace and why we think that our HouseSpace is actually able to help in hearing everybody's voice. Because typically, if you think that you ask like 1,000 people about their opinion, you get 1,000 answers. If you get 1,000 answers, but I think those kinds of amounts of answers really can tell you a story if you just let all the voices be heard. And that's why our customers at HouseSpace are using also our artificial intelligence to help to see beyond the biases that sometimes actually exist.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting, you're using the example of we've got 1,000 people, we're going to ask them, let's actually get 1,000 answers. Now, classically, when we ask, we get very few answers. But if we think about how the ask is done, classically, it's like, let's do a town hall. We're going to have this huge room. Everyone's in the room. There's a couple of mics set up. And we're now going to ask someone to stand up, walk to the front of the room, stand in front of the entire group, and have their voice actually physically heard. And you look at, and I love that reaction, because we look at what are the top 10 fears in life. And public speaking is classically right up there as number 1 or 2. And you're asking people to speak publicly. And oftentimes what they need to say is not positive. It's very much like, I'm going to stand up in front of the entire organization and effectively criticize the leaders to say, this isn't going to work because of this, or I'm going to raise the concern, etc. And we saw this coming into the year 2000, so Y2K. People knew about the big issues with Y2K 20, 30 years before it occurred. All of the banking systems ran through their Y2K system about 20, 25 years before, because all the mortgages were being amortized on that 20, 25 year timeline. So they knew about it. But all of the leaders are like, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news. So they played hot potato and they passed it off to the next person and the next person until they couldn't anymore. And suddenly it became a great big deal. Now, imagine if instead of waiting until the 11th hour, that these leaders had the courage to say, you know what, we've got this issue looming on the horizon. It's 10 years out. Let's fix it now. Let's actually address it at more of a proper timeline, as opposed to waiting to the last minute, because none of us wants to be the bearer of bad news. But what I love about HouseSpace is it really removes a lot of that fear of public speaking, because we have a common voice. We're all coming into the platform. It can be done anonymously. It can be done with knowing who the person is. It can remove some of those biases, like the seniority bias, or that fear of public speaking, where I can actually submit this in more of a social media style way and really then have my voice heard. And then, as you said, we can use the artificial intelligence to actually make some sense of all of that.
And in big changes or in small changes, the diversity of talk is really needed.
Absolutely.
And as you mentioned, sense making about everything that's been said is also very important.
Yeah, love it. And having that diversity of voice and having that diversity of thought, so that we can really truly hear what is going on. We can break down some of that CEO disease we talked about earlier and actually hear from folks. So we did just introduce this concept of biases. There's a number of them. Let's actually explore that a little bit deeper in our next episode. Let's wrap this one up here, because I think we've got some good thoughts for people to digest, and we'll see you next time as we dig into this whole thing of biases and how we tend to react as humans.